Today on the Regain Wellness Podcast, debunking game changers and why you need to stop watching Netflix documentaries. Hey there, what's happening? Welcome back to the Regain Wellness Podcast. I'm Jamie. I run regainwellness.com. Thanks for coming on out today. I don't want to waste any time and get into all of this because there's a lot to cover. And we're talking about the documentary that came out on Netflix maybe a month ago called Game Changers, based around why athletes should use a plant-based diet and why, protein isn't helping you as far as performance and health and everything like that. So, there's a lot to go over in this, and hopefully you've seen this documentary. And the whole thing this podcast is about is not getting your health and science information from things that are basically entertainment. And we'll get more into that in a bit. So we'll jump right into it and break down everything that went on in this documentary, looking at the science, the health info, what's right, what's wrong. Okay, here we go. So this will be a weird thing to start off with, but from my perspective, my diet is completely plant-based. It's not fully vegan at all, but I'd say 80% of the time it is. I just believe there is some room for animal products, but not as much as you would think, and from the right sources, which again we'll get to in a little bit. So my personal viewpoint and standpoint is, your diet, even if you're like the biggest carnivore in the world, your diet still needs to be completely plant-based. My problem is with documentaries and works like this that don't do a good job at sharing the science, cherry picking specific data that will, hold up with their original viewpoint and not presenting both sides. So they're really doing you a disservice by not giving you all the full information. So there's a lot of really good resources now that have put up a lot of I've read quite a lot of the studies they reference in this documentary, and there's a bunch of different websites. One's called Tactic Method, where they put all these studies and stuff in one area, which is really helpful, and giving more interpretations plus my own and all put together. So one of the main premise with the documentary is an athlete who's injured and he starts doing research on nutrition and getting to the viewpoint that protein is not needed for energy for athletes as much as they think. And this is just like, to me, the first weird indicator, because I thought it was like basic, even public school knowledge, that protein is, it can work as an energy source. Your body has an ability called gluconeogenesis, where it can break down substances like protein and turn them into glucose for your body to run off of. So technically you can run off protein. But protein, as we know, is, for building and repair and not energy. And, though it can be used for energy, but it's also for like immune system function, repairing ligaments, tendons, improving your hair, your nails, everything like that. We know carbohydrates as an amazing source of fuel for performance and athletes. So, that was just a head scratch right off the bat. I thought that was kind of common knowledge. But I'm going to show you probably what the full intent with this documentary really was at the end of this. The thing that's important to look on here is the studies that they reference. And this is just such a nightmare, because many of the studies that are out there that are regarding around nutrition, whether it's, looking at plant-based diets or red meat studies, they're based on what they call observational studies. These are, if you see the word observational studies, take that as the bottom feeder level of studies, like the poorest science there is. They come in the form of cross-sectional studies, prospective studies, retrospective studies. Basically what they're doing is observing what people eat or ate, and then they relate it to what diseases or health problems they might have. So the way they do this, they're not doing blood tests and urinary analysis. It's basically just a food journal. People just writing down what they had. And, what did you have for breakfast last Tuesday? How about dinner 4 nights ago? How big was the serving size? How was it prepared? Do you know every ingredient or potentially additives that went in? What did you combine it with? What did you eat? You know, all these things that you're probably not going to remember. And a lot of the time when people are recording these things, they tend to, you know, estimate, or they overestimate, or they completely forget, or they don't want their diet to seem as bad as it really is. So they kind of downplay it a little bit. This is what they're getting for their research to conduct these studies off of. And then with all these different variables, you can draw a lot of conclusions. And the biggest thing, if you're, you know, not wanting to go too deep and learning about how studies are published and conclusions, is the big idea between correlation and causation. Causation means something directly caused whatever effect. Correlation means they're just kind of related. When you group all these things together, you can come up with various conclusions. The problem is you can come up with insane conclusions. Just examples, there are correlated studies that say when the sale of ice cream goes up, so does the murder rate. And I've mentioned this before on the show, just to show you kind of like how misleading some of these correlated studies could be. So the idea is like when the summer, you know, weather comes around, the weather gets hotter, people tend to go out for more ice cream. They want that cool treat. When the weather goes up, people get a little more hot, a little more irritable, a little more aggressive, especially in public areas and in big cities. And that tends to lead to more violent crimes and murders. So if you were looking at all these data points, you see ice cream sales are up, but then murder is also up. So you could make the conclusion that increases in ice cream lead to higher murder rates, you know, as absurd as that is. There's one I was just looking at today. They're looking at the basketball player James Harden. They put all these, this isn't actually, they did a scientific based study, and they took all these data points and formulas, and they looked at his gameplay was worse based on the city's amount of strip clubs they have. And that when he was on the road in a city that had a lot of higher end and good strip clubs, his performance went down. When he went into cities where they didn't have a lot of strip clubs, his performance went up. So that's just an example of the whole correlation versus causation issue. So in Game Changers and a lot of these Netflix documentaries, these are the studies they're referring to, and they pop them up on the screen. They are these observational studies that are not really reliable. They're not very accurate, and they're independently observed. They're overly refuted. So, I mean, that's what we're looking at when they reference their studies. So the big thing they feature is, of course, like it's based around athletes, and a big part of the documentary is talking about elite athletes who have, switched over to a plant-based diet. They start off with, I mean, one of the big ones is the Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz thing. If you're a UFC fan, they point out that in 2016, Nate Diaz had to come in like sort of last second with 2 weeks to go to fight Conor McGregor. I forget who he was fighting, had to pull out and everything like that. And Conor McGregor makes note that he's a big meat eater and he eats steak 3 times a day. And Nate Diaz is a plant eater. And Nate, if you remember this, Nate Diaz smoked McGregor pretty well in this fight. So they're like, okay, let's score one for a plant-based diet. The problem is, they kind of looked at Nate Diaz as being the underdog in this fight, but they don't mention Conor McGregor had to go up 2 weight classes to fight him to make this thing happen. And then even though he was 2 weight classes higher in a short amount of time, that's why he was eating so much and so much steak. The day of the fight, he was still 15, 20 pounds lighter in the ring, which is a massive difference. So, that after that, they start, mentioning some other athletes. They had Scott Urek, who's an ultramarathon runner. Morgan Mitchell is a 400-meter sprinter. There's a cyclist in there. And, of course, these athletes need a huge amount of carbs all the time. And they don't, they also don't mention what they were potentially eating before, what their diet was like, whatever. And so they start looking at, besides the high endurance thing, more of like the big boys, they call it. And they're looking at an Olympic weightlifter named Kendrick Ferris. There's a strongman competitor named Patrick Bobamine, I think. Bryant Jennings, the boxer. Derek Morgan, the linebacker. Again, you don't get to see what their diet and training look like before they had switched over, with a few of these, like the linebacker specifically talking about always liking to eat fried chicken, so that obviously got him pretty far. I mean, they don't mention at all that the weightlifter was stripped of all his titles because he came back testing positive for steroids. They even had the audacity to show images of Carl Lewis, a noted drug user from races, specifically the 88 games in Seoul, when, if you remember, our Canadian Ben Johnson won the race. They call that the dirtiest race in history because 7 out of those 10 all tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs, including Carl Lewis. I cannot believe they showed him in this thing. And the thing is, with no disrespect to the athletes that they use, because they're all elite, they are not the best in their fields, not even close. The guy who was the strongman, the other Olympic weightlifter, finished, I think, 8th in the previous Olympics and then 10th. And again, I hate doing this with athletes, but like Derek Morgan, good linebacker, but not the best in his field. None of the athletes they picked were the top in their fields. And when you look at the top in their respective sports, they tend to consume some animal protein, not tons, but some. Let's look at one of the best football players, Tom Brady. He eats a lot of lean meats, but very clean, very organic. This will be key all the time. He eats wild-caught salmon. Michael Phelps, one of the best athletes and Olympians of all time, ate a ton of eggs in his prime, a lot of ham and cheese sandwiches, pizza, things like that. LeBron James, one of the best there is, and again, of all time in basketball. He eats a lot of chicken, a lot of salmon, a lot of eggs. Sidney Crosby, who's one of the best hockey players of this generation, eats a lot of eggs, a lot of turkey bacon, but he keeps things very organic. Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player of all time, and arguably the greatest athlete of all time when it comes to statistics and championships, and he has more records in his sport than anyone in any other sport ever, and all that sort of stuff. He ate, his diet was a lot of, standard meat and potatoes. He would sometimes eat 4 to 5 hot dogs before a game. That and was able to function off that. Another example of just crazy diet is, again, maybe one of the best athletes of all time, Usain Bolt, who before he broke the 100-meter record in Beijing, the meal he had before that race, chicken McNuggets. This is just why you can't look at the top athletes, even the lower level athletes in their sport, because these people are genetic freaks, and it's not even that there is as much like elite athletes, which they are. It's more that the tops in their sport, again, even the lowest level guy in the whatever pro sport it is, basketball, hockey, football, it's not that they're necessarily the best athlete. They're the best performers. They just have more mental capacity and ability to perform their sport. And usually the top guys in every sport are usually one of the worst athletes. Like Wayne Gretzky, the greatest hockey player of all time, was small, very weak, could not bench press his own body weight, had a very bad slap shot, was a slow skater, and dominated his sport like no one else in history. And it's kind of irrelevant with all of these guys and girls and tops in their field. They are just at a different level that no one else can be. If you take the average pro sport, you've got maybe, 600 to 700 athletes in the entire league, and that's out of the millions and millions that play around the world. The Olympic athletes that are in the finals, it's a handful of people. So it's using athletes in the top athletes in any field is just never a good thing, because if we're basing that on, say, Usain Bolt's diet, if I go out and eat 50 chicken McNuggets, I'm obviously not going to perform. It kind of doesn't matter what Usain Bolt eats, or guys like that, or Tom Brady or Sidney Crosby, because they just have this mindset and work ethic and focus and mental clarity in their sport that makes them rise above everyone else. So here's a good thing from the tactic method that talks about what they refer to in the documentary as protein quality of plants versus animals. And they argue in the movie that plant-based foods are higher quality and actually better and more complete sources of protein than animal plant-based foods. But when you look at the science, when they talk about a complete protein, that's one that contains all the essential amino acids in, the right amounts. Incomplete proteins are either insufficient in amounts of one or many essential amino acids, or they just don't have them at all. Animal proteins have all the essential amino acids you need to function and in the correct amount. So plants, on the other hand, do not. Well, there's some that, contain all the essential amino acids, thinking like quinoa just comes to mind is like a complete protein. You have to combine plants to ensure you're getting all the essential amino acids. And again, this isn't a big problem. Like I said, my diet is primarily plant-based, so it just makes sure you have to combine a lot of things. So like rice and beans, just as an example, if you put those together, you're getting a complete protein. So then they're talking about quality with regards to protein as it pertains to what they call bioavailability, and that's your body's ability to digest something. And when they look at bioavailability of proteins, they use the egg as the kind of perfect gold standard of say 100. That means it's, the best absorbed, the best utilized, everything like that. Say like a whey protein is like 108. That's the bioavailability of that. Beef has around a 92% bioavailability, so can be absorbed pretty well, not as good as the egg. The highest vegetarian sources we have that are, that complete protein are the kidney bean. They score around a 54%. But they're saying that plant eaters not only get enough protein, but 70% more than they need, and that meat eaters still get roughly half of their protein from plants. So this just gets a little confusing, because when you do break down, again, these are the studies they looked at of, this is like a big one, like 71,000 people. When they looked at the protein per day that they were getting on average, a strict vegetarian is getting around 70 grams a day. A non-vegetarian is getting around 74.7 grams a day. So, based on what they're recommending in the movie, they're saying you should be getting around 50 grams per day, which is, I don't know, for an athlete is probably a little low. And then they're saying it's easy to make up that protein. Instead of say having 3 ounces of beef, they're like, just have a peanut butter sandwich, which again is like baffling me. To get the amount of protein that's in 3 ounces of beef, that's around 20 grams. You would have to have a peanut butter sandwich with 5 heaping tablespoons of peanut butter. Good luck choking that down. That's also going to contain around 40 grams of fat, and it's going to have close to 500 calories. Plus, whatever bread and, refined carb crap you're mixing that all together with. And I don't know if they're talking about a regular Skippy peanut butter off the store shelves. I'm going to assume not, because those are just basically icing sugar that tastes like peanuts. Hopefully they're talking about like a true raw natural peanut butter. Maybe an almond butter would be better. Again, but they just like pass it off. Like, just have a peanut butter sandwich. Like, it's not that simple. If you use just however you would make a normal peanut butter sandwich, the amount you would take with a knife to put it together, you're probably getting, I'd say 3 to 4 grams of protein tops. And again, that's if you're using a like true raw natural like chunky peanut butter. If you're using like a Skippy or whatever, I don't know, it's maybe 2. You're probably getting more protein from the bread than you are from the peanut butter. And if you think of the amount of sugar that's all packed in that, not ideal. Another really compelling part is the endothelial test during this. Again, so hopefully you've seen this, so you know what I'm talking about. This is when they brought in 3 players from the Miami Dolphins to do this test where they test the viscosity of their blood after eating. Again, this is more of a demonstration. They take a plant-based burrito, a chicken burrito, and a red meat burrito. And the endothelial function has to do with, again, that relative viscosity of the blood, which is affected by the diet. The problem they don't point out is that, so they're holding up the vials of blood, and, the ones are more clear compared to the ones after eating meat. But that endothelial function and the viscosity of the blood is affected by a ton of things, not just diet. Hydration, probably the biggest one up there. Blood volume, your oxygen concentration. Then, one of the players was vegan and the other two liked fast food. So even before they eat the burritos, like, what's their blood going to be like already? Like, think of the difference in their diet quality if they're eating fast food and fried chicken. And, they compare their blood cells from the fast food guys to the vegan, and the vegan shows superior endothelial function. But of course it would. So then they bring them in and they all eat a bean burrito, and they do the same test, and you look at the superior endothelial function, and the blood looks cleaner. And the problem is this is not a scientifically validated test because, again, they're not looking at things like sleep, their training volume, the hydration, their stress. Were they coming off of practice or a game day when your stress hormones are higher? Again, and they ignore everything else they eat that day, which is, again, super significant. This is where there's some studies they put on the screen here, and there's a notable one that suggests the ingestion of specifically the Hass avocado, HASS, could modulate the inflammatory response caused by one hamburger meal. So, eat your hamburger, but if you have this Hass avocado, it's going to clean up your blood. The interesting thing, this was a pilot study of only 11 people, which is basically not even considered a study at so low, and it was funded by, guess who, the Hass avocado brand. So I think the big thing in this part is that, again, there's like 20 different journal articles they mention, and they talk about the foods that are important to keeping, the blood, I guess, as clean as possible. And they're saying ingesting, grape juice, blueberries, black tea, green tea, spinach, apples, dark chocolate, raspberries, all those similar foods can improve your endothelial function. Improve your vessel function, lower blood pressure, and improve platelet function. The problem is in none of those studies that they reference, again, like you can look all these ones up, again, like tacticmethod.com was one good resource that put them all together. None of those studies suggest that meat should be removed from the diet. That they just refer to what we already know, that you need to include a lot of fruits and vegetables in your diet. And not just that, a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, eating the full spectrum color of the rainbow and getting as many of those different phytonutrients and antioxidants as you can. So again, stuff we already know, but they don't really show, I don't know that they're being dishonest. They're tending to ignore what the studies are actually saying. And this is what's happening with a lot of these other Netflix-based documentaries. They're kind of, cherry picking their data from inferior-based studies and then ignoring any of the other beneficial information and just not presenting you with the full range of information. And to me, that's, pretty much a disservice. Another part in Game Changers they go over is the whole animal protein and heart health thing. And again, like, hopefully you're getting the point. I'm not saying even though animal protein can be a part of your diet, it's not something you need to be eating all day long. Like, we're talking maybe a couple times a week of 6 to 8 ounces max on those days, and you're probably fine covered as far as animal protein quantity and quality. And you're obviously wanting to get those from the cleanest sources possible, not from factory farm raised antibiotic full hormone filled animals, from grass fed pure natural organic animals and like wild caught salmon and genuine free range chicken and eggs. And it's just that small amount. It's not bacon and burgers all day long. That's obviously a terrible idea, just a little bit, but super clean. So the animal protein heart health thing is, they're talking about the cholesterol lowering abilities of plants and a plant-based diet. And they go into the guy's, father's health struggles, and he had a heart attack, and he liked to eat a lot of meat pies and pork pies and stuff like that. They look at the firefighters, again, who they don't really kind of share how poor their diets were with everything else. Like, a lot of people who have had heart attacks, I think it's something like half those people have low cholesterol. So there's other things going on. Like, we're not looking at just the issue of the animal protein. There's a lot of other factors involved in health like that. And then the studies cited in this part of the documentary, they acknowledge the positive effects that plant intake has on heart health, specifically, lowering those risk factors for heart disease. They did not specifically recommend like stopping animal protein intake altogether. And they didn't acknowledge the other factors that are ignored when they look at the connections, again, the correlations between animal protein and heart health. Like, they're not looking at these people if they're smoking, and a lot of them are. They're not looking at stress management. They're not looking at exercise. This was a big thing in the China study. If you've ever seen Forks Over Knives, they were looking at the specific area of China where their, heart disease and things like that were more prevalent. And again, they were taking their data based on all these observational studies and these food journals, and they were just looking at, trying to connect the dots, and they're seeing, animal protein intake, heart disease, and then boom, they connect that. They were ignoring all those other things, again, with a lot of these people indicating they were smokers, a lack of exercise, working high stress jobs, other poor diet. So again, it's such irresponsible reporting. And again, I'm saying a plant-based diet is 100% what you should be eating. I just don't like this, inferior kind of hacky science and reporting of that science. Then there's a part talking about how our ancestors were vegetarian. This gets completely out of hand because human beings have survived in such unhospitable environments and scenarios over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. You take, like, say, the Inuits in the northern part of the world who live primarily on animal fat and always have. And then there's, tribes in the South Pacific that would only survive on plants and sweet potatoes, and then everything in between. And again, they're living in a time and era where they're in purely organic environments, and they're not, fighting traffic to get to work in the rat race and then exposed to pollution and toxins and pesticides and whatever. That's a whole other thing. But in this part of the documentary, they're trying to convince us, because our teeth are flat and that we have full color vision and things like that, that we are not meant to eat meat. And of course, early humans ate plants, but that was just part of it. And of course, we ate meat at the same time too. Again, depending where you are in the world and stuff like that. If you look at the globe, there's what they call the frost line on the Earth, where vegetation doesn't grow past that point. So, and then huge parts of, say, Northern Africa or China, where vegetation just hasn't grown. So you would have to hunt and things like that. And these populations aren't hunting, they're making weapons and partly, survival battles, but they are, finding in these, go to one of the natural history museums. I mean, the New York one's probably one of the best, and learning how the early humans grew and developed, and then, finding the archaeological sites with animal bones and stuff like that. And, they're not hunting kale or apples. And then another thing we always forget with primitive ancestors and the Paleolithic ancestors, they would only have these, say, fruits or say fruits as an example, only one time a year for this very short window. It's not like they can go to a grocery store in January like we can and get blueberries that come from Mexico or kiwis from the other side of the world. They only had these short little windows where this vegetation was actually growing. I mean, how long, say the apple season, I don't know, 2-3 months, you get it. And that's, eating fruit at its ripest state. So in this part of the movie, they're going back and forth about that idea of, should we only eat meat? Should we only? It's not that. It's not that we're are herbivores or omnivores. We're a bit of both. But again, I'm saying we fall more on the plant-based side with a little bit of room for animal protein, as long as, again, it's from those good, clean sources. They don't make any mention, and this is a massively frustrating part, where they just don't make any mention of the idea how humans and our brains develop because of things like animal fats and true omega-3s, and that our brains are actually made up of fat. Our cells, they're made up of fat, specifically these omega-3s, and that it's seen that our intake of, it's not even about animal protein, it's more about like animal fat. You need to read the book Primal Body, Primal Mind by Norga Gauda. So I've had on this show talking about the development of humans, and when they started consuming, again, more the animal fat is when brain size started to develop and mature and grow and things like that, and how important omega-3s are to the brain. And yes, you can get some in, like chia seeds and some plant-based foods, but it's in more of an inferior form, like that ALA form compared to, you've heard like EPA and DHA, which you can find in animal products like fish. And those are the ones, primarily used better by the brain. And with a lot of people with cognitive problems and, things like depression, they usually show a low level of omega-3s. Specifically, a lot of vegans or plant-based eaters, because they're not getting that higher quality form of omega-3. And again, that seemed to be at the forefront of what made us human, was eating more of those real fats. They again talk about how, we probably only ever needed plants because glucose is our primary fuel source. And, so obviously we're only meant to eat plants because that's how we get our fuel. But, since glucose can be a very good preferred fuel source, again, we're equipped with that metabolic backup mechanism called, I said before, gluconeogenesis, which allows us to produce glucose, sugars, from non-carbohydrate precursors like protein and fat, which means at some point humans were eating animal protein and animal fat. And during periods where they needed a little more energy for whatever situation, our bodies had developed the ability to turn those things into glucose. Here's probably the funniest part of the documentary, where they're looking at testosterone. And I think that's one of the big drivers behind the movie. It's like because they call it game changers, and they're basing it around athletes and testosterone, and only men can bend. I don't know. Take that how you will. But, they bring in those athletes. They eat the meat burritos and the bean burritos, and they're measuring erectile strength and frequency and all that stuff. But again, this is more of a experiment and not a test. It's not a scientifically validated testing method. They provide one data point for each test condition, which is considered statistically insignificant. And again, this experiment fails to consider or attempt to look at the other variables that have factors in this whole testosterone thing. Specifically, again, sleep, muscle fatigue. What was their workout like that day? They could be severely depleted in testosterone, or if it was a rest day or an active recovery day, what's their training volume like, the stress, their hydration, salt, sodium status, alcohol consumption the night before, their genetic predisposition. Like, they're just not looking at anything of this nature. And again, one of the studies, I think here they talk about the studies comparing men eating animal protein and men eating plant protein have demonstrated no difference in testosterone level. And again, you just have to read these journals. That they do cite them. I'll give them credit for that, but you just have to read them. The filmmakers claim that the vegans actually have higher testosterone than meat eaters, and this just blatantly omits a really important difference between vegans and meat eaters. While some of the studies found total testosterone to be higher in vegans, multiple studies indicate that sex hormone binding globulin was also substantially higher in vegans. Because this sex hormone binding globulin binds to sex hormones, testosterone, the actual amount of free testosterone was equal between the vegan and meat-eating group. And again, just a very convenient detail to leave out of the documentary. They talk about the estrogen problem from drinking cow's milk, and in it they talk about the dairy industry and saying that simply drinking cow's milk can increase a man's estrogen levels by 26% while dropping testosterone levels by 18%. And that's true because it's a little factoid from this pilot study performed on 7 men drinking milk exclusively from pregnant cows. This is horrifying. Just that a test like this would happen, and then using that study as an example, like, why not touch it? I mean, the purpose of that study was to evaluate the impact of drinking milk specifically from pregnant cows, and not to serve as a model for dairy consumption as a whole. I personally don't see any reason to consume dairy at all. So like, that's what I'm saying. I'm agreeing in avoiding dairy. I'm just like disgusted how they're using studies like this to kind of misconstrue information. I mean, to drink, this is probably a whole side tangent. I mean, to drink milk, if you like it, that's fine. But to drink the milk, which is filtered blood from another species, when even that species and our own species isn't meant to drink it past however many months. I mean, with cows, they go to like 2 years or whatever. But it's so bizarre. And considering what is potentially in that milk as far as antibiotics and hormones, and that the pasteurization process can kill a lot of, kills the bad bacteria, but it kills the good bacteria. It causes them to split open, and it causes to form what they call cytotoxins. And those cause a histamine response in the body, which is, kind of like allergies. So it's why people find with dairy, they sometimes get like phlegmy and congested and whatever. And a lot of singers and opera singers have to avoid milk and dairy products for that reason before performances, because of that response. So I'm like honestly not a big fan of dairy. I think kefir can be okay. If you know kefir, it's a real probiotic. It's a fermented milk product. And in this case, it's being fermented down so much it's not even really dairy. It's sort of dairy at that point, but it doesn't really have lactose in it anymore. Like lactose intolerant people can consume kefir, and it's an amazing probiotic and great for gut health and whatever. But there's lots of other great probiotic choices out there, like kombucha, kefir, sauerkraut, stuff like that. So I mean, you don't really have to go dairy at all. So speaking of dairy and cows, this is what almost caused me just to turn this thing off, because it was when they start comparing people to animals, and that should be our reasons behind things, that like my eyes just glaze over when someone ever makes that argument. And if you hear people making that, that's to me the biggest red flag. And like I wanted to stop watching because that's such an asinine thing to say, but I wanted to keep watching to see where they're going from it. So specifically that one guy talking about how if you want to be strong as an ox, you should eat like an ox, which is just such a juvenile response. It's also saying like, well, the biggest animal of all time is the blue whale. Should I just eat plankton? Or if I want to get fat as a hippo, should I just eat like a hippo and eat plants all day? You cannot compare two different species, especially things like an ox or a cow or anything that they call like ruminants, where they have to be eating constantly all day, eating grass, that we have completely different digestive systems. I mean, obviously that we're two different species should be enough right there. But when you look at, say, like an ox or a cow, or, cows, they have the 4 stomachs because they're constantly having to break down all this food because they're eating a very low calorie substance and grass and plants and stuff like that. And they actually, like in the case of the ruminants and cows, they have this bacterial fermentation digestive system, which is breaking down these plant substances actually into fatty acids. So their bodies are technically running on fat. We have a hydrochloric acid-based digestive system, which is much more acidic and meant to break down peptides and proteins and fats like that. So like to compare two different species with two different digestive systems, and it's just unbelievable. And then talking about like a gorilla, how a gorilla eats plants and will F up a human. Yeah, of course it would. When you look at the relative size and strength, it's the equivalent of like me saying I could F up that 14-pound puppy, when you're looking at the size disparity. Same thing with gorillas. They have a much, much longer large intestine and colon because of having to break down these plant-based materials. We don't have that. They're eating upwards of 60 to 70 pounds of plants a day. Humans don't have to do that. We can basically run off one meal for a couple days if we had to, if you're thinking from a Paleolithic standpoint, where it would have been a very higher fat, dense protein based with, I don't throw in some other plants or nuts and seeds like that. But we can run off for days off that sort of thing. Not the gorilla. They have to eat all day. And the thing is with gorillas and chimpanzees, they're, primarily plant-based animal, but they do eat other animals. I mean, don't do this, but look up videos of chimpanzees attacking and killing and eating other animals. It's pretty horrific. And the gorillas themselves, gorillas won't kill big animals, but they regularly eat small ones. They eat a lot of insects. Again, it doesn't make up a big part of their diet, but it does make up part of their diet. More about gorillas eating animals. This is from National Geographic. And there's a recent study on, I think these are lowland gorillas, in the national park in Gabon, and they found DNA from monkeys and small forest animals, specifically these small antelopes called duikers, Duikers. They found this DNA in the feces of these wild African western lowland gorillas. Still from National Geographic, looking at like chimpanzees and the bonobo cousins, they're known, like they hunt other mammals, including monkeys. And they're the people from National Geographic, just stating that most herbivores can digest meat quite easily. Here's the good part of this documentary that I 1,000,000% agree with, and this is over the issues of farming and livestock production and how it's destroying the climate and destroying the land and the amount of the animal protein growing through these factory farming. The sustainability is just not happening. The pollution, the increase in carbon in the atmosphere. Yeah, like 1,000,000%. That's the problem with all these things. And the documentaries that are focused on this, that are 100% right. And in this one, yeah, they're 1,000,000% right on the issue of factory farming and what's happening from animal agriculture. But they're two different conversations. You know what I mean? Like you can't use that just to justify staying away from animal proteins that are sustainably raised and again, like coming from local farms where they're actually free range animals, organic, living as they're supposed to, eating grass not treated with antibiotics or hormones. It's basically a completely different animal than these factory farmed confinement lot versions that are not just worse for you. They're also the stuff's destroying the environment, the factory fishing and overfishing the seas and how that's throwing the ecosystem out of whack. Again, like that's a whole other conversation, but yeah, they're completely right about that. So let's look at actually what's the true intent with this documentary. And that involves looking at who produced this thing. The executive producer of Game Changers was James Cameron, noted filmmaker of Titanic, Avatar, everything like that. He is also now CEO of Verdient Foods, which is an organic pea protein company with the goal of becoming the largest pea protein company and manufacturing facility in North America. And he's just sunk $140 million into this whole venture. So what you're watching is basically a 90-minute commercial for this guy's new business. After that, his wife, who played the old woman's mother in Titanic, that's James Cameron's wife, she's an executive producer. She founded Verdient Foods. They looked at, say, Arnold Schwarzenegger, ex-meat eater, whatever, very passionate vegan, also has interests in things like this. Pamela Anderson, I think, is one of the producers somehow, who has a plant-based protein interest. Even the medical professionals interviewed in this documentary sell vegan products. So Dr. Dean Ornish, he's the author of Undo It. He leads vegan retreats and sells programs. The doctor did the testosterone stuff. He has a plant-based book he's selling. Robert Vogel, he's selling a book after this. Dr. Caldwell Esseltine sells a cookbook and DVDs. Dr. James Loomis has a plant-based meal planning service sort of company. And I don't want to call this like propaganda, but the whole thing is based around James Cameron's new pea protein company and all the money he's sunk into it. So a bit of a conflict of interest there, and hard to take at face value when they're going to only find and use points that support what's in their best interest, which is these money-making ventures. The problem is, like, this thing could have been done so much better, and include a little bit of just the science and the reasoning behind some use or benefits of only the right type of animal protein products, but put this all together and still show the benefits of a plant-based diet, but just present all the information. Don't be shady about it. Even just the whole connection, the guy who sort of hosts this movie, James, Wilkes, and he goes on about Bruce Lee, and he idolizes Bruce Lee, and he's wanting to follow everything like that. Bruce Lee used to eat a ton of organ meats, and that was his he used them as like a natural high mineral multivitamin. He ate a ton of vegetables and a ton of plant-based things, but he ate a lot of steak and, again, like liver for his, go-to organ meat. He ate beef and oyster sauce. So how much are you supposed to replicate the guy you idolize? You know what I mean? It's just all this kind of mess and combination of information and disinformation in the same spot. So let's cut it off there. It's probably a lot to digest, but again, use this as sort of your own jumping off point and do your own research, because all this stuff is out there. The problem is it takes work to go through. So that's why things like these Netflix documentaries or reports you see on TV, they can just grab these quick little headlines and stuff, knowing people aren't going to go deeper into it, and they're just not presenting all the information. So that, again, as much as my diet is plant-based, and probably vegan 70 to 80% of the time, as a nutritionist and someone who just studies this stuff, I just despise seeing this kind of Bush League type research and presentation of scientific information, which is just masquerading again as James Cameron's little project commercial to support his new business. Okay, so again, thanks for listening. Hopefully you like this, and it encourages you to be more proactive with your own health and finding out relevant information and digging through things and not being complacent, which is, the damage that happens for a lot of people. It takes work to be healthy. If it was easy, everyone would be healthy and fit and have a perfect diet. But it's just, as we have more access to more information, we get even more disinformation, and it's hard to sift through it all. So hopefully this helps a little bit, and eventually you draw your own conclusions to everything. But thanks for listening, taking the time to listen to the show. If you like it, subscribe. I should be everywhere that you find podcasts, but I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.